Hey Rogers, I'm the director of the Forerunner, and I'm starting a series within a series. I've been writing a lot about the Russia-Ukraine crisis and talking about what's happening, what's really happening in the crisis, as opposed to the story that we're getting, the false narrative from our legacy media. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the reason why I'm interested in Russia and Ukraine. First of all, beyond being a missionary or short-term missionary to Russia and Ukraine for over 10 years, actually from 1991 all the way through 2007, which was over 16 years, I traveled on several trips to Russia and Ukraine. We established a newspaper that was very influential throughout churches in the whole region. All 15 republics of the Soviet Union received copies. And I also helped a TV ministry, basically a video production ministry more accurately, in Vladimir, Russia. The newspaper was based in Kyiv, Ukraine, and then later I took many trips to Russia as well, and was in a lot of different regions throughout eastern Russia and also in western Ukraine and eastern Ukraine. So I have a little bit of a background on the culture and the people there. Many of my good friends are from there. But the reason why I'm excited about what's going on right now with the war is not because I'm pro-Putin or I favor Russia over Ukraine. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm excited about this. This is the emerging multipolar world. And we have the opportunity to be rebuilding our Christian civilization in America based on what's happening in China, India, Russia, and other places. So I'm going to explain exactly what I mean by that. I've had several people recently ask me, what do I mean by a multipolar world and what do I mean by a civilization state? Well, civilization states are described by an American political scientist, Samuel P. Huntington. And there was this book called Clash of Civilizations and the Making of the World, not the New World Order, but the World Order. Okay? So the whole idea of a civilization state is a country that represents not just a historical territory, an ethno-linguistic group, or a body of governance. In other words, not just ethnicity, not just borders, not just politics, but a unique civilization in its own right. It's distinguished from the concept of a nation state by describing a country's dominant social political modes, blah, 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 blah. You can read on this if you want. And what happened was people started to notice that there are these civilization states that are these ancient cultures that are now emerging again. Either ancient cultures or cultures that were started in the early Middle Ages, okay, like Egypt, India, Russia, China, and so on. And that these are now kind of like the idea of a civilization state is in these countries is overtaking the idea of a nation state. So a lot of people, when they talk about a country or a nation, what they're really thinking of is a nation state. And the concept of a nation state, it's where the state, and then it's a political unit in which the state and the nation are congruent. Okay, and it has different meanings to it, but essentially the origins, the most common story is that at the end of the 30 Years' War, which was the time of the Reformation, Catholics and Protestants were fighting against each other, and what happened was there were two cities. One city was Protestant, the other city was Catholic, and they had just exhausted the ability to fight. They had exhausted the ability to fight each other. It had devastated Europe. People were living in a state of poverty. A huge number of people died. It brought on plagues and all kinds of other things. So they just decided, look, we'll draw lines around us politically. Your state will be Protestant and our state will be Catholic. And even though they were both Germans, they were both the same culture, the political lines that they drew became the nation state. And then that became the model over a period of time by the late 1700s. This was the late 1600s or the early 1600s, I believe, with the 30 Years' War. Let me look this up because I don't want to give you... 30 Years' War went from the 1500s to the 1600s. I don't know the exact years, but there was a 100-year period after that. Let's just look this up real quick. okay, so it was the 1600s. So it was 1618 to 1648. Well, 100 years after that, into the time of the French Revolution, most of Europe became a nation state, some type of a nation state. So this was like the breakup of the Holy Roman Empire, which was a civilization, into separate nation states. Okay, and then what also happened around the time of 1618? Well, America was founded. Now, America was founded as a Christian civilization, not as a nation state, but a Christian civilization. Even up until the time of the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, people still thought of America as a Christian civilization. The different states in America were united by things like the Great Awakening, by the fact that you had, Puritans in New England, but among the Puritans there were Baptists, there were Congregationalists, there were Presbyterian Congregationalists, and there were Presbyterians, there were Congregationalist Baptists, and there were Episcopalians in other parts of the colonies. But basically, they were Calvinist Protestants who had a strong work ethic, and they wanted to see the kingdom of God on earth. That was their goal. So they saw themselves very much as kingdom people, not as political people, right? And so at the time of the revolution, it was very natural for them to come together and say, well, even though, Maryland is Catholic and Pennsylvania is Quaker and they're not really like us, we can still come together because we all agree that this is a Christian civilization. All right. So getting back to this is Samuel Huntington, and I don't agree with everything that he says. He wrote this back in 1996, and I think that the scenario has changed since then. But he kind of proposed this kind of a world where you'd have the European, the Western states. This is the main thing I don't agree with. I don't agree that there's a Western nation, there's a Western civilization state. I think that the historic civilization of the West is Christian, and within that you have different groups. Like the United States is an Anglo-Saxon Protestant civilization, and so we're closely related to England, to Holland, somewhat to Germany, and also to Scotland. That's our civilizational root, are the Scottish Presbyterian philosophers and the Puritan Anglo-Saxons, right? Especially not so much the Episcopalians in England, but the people who lived in the East and West Midlands of England who immigrated to America, and they founded colonies up and down the coast, as well as the Dutch Reformed who came to New York, and later the Episcopalians who came to Virginia. And then within America, you kind of like have North and South. You have more of like a aristocratic Christian civilization and more of a congregationalist, kind of like more of a I don't want to call it a democratic, more of a democratic civilization where people, the common person was seen as being able to rise in the society and become, you have people like, by the time of the revolution, you had people like Alexander Hamilton, who came from very obscure roots, and he became a great legislator. He became a great statesman. So that was like the northern Christian civilization, and you had the southern Christian. But within that, people were Christian. It was in South America, it's more Catholic, right? In Russia and Greece, this whole area of the world is more Orthodox. And then you get these other countries. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa is very Christian. Northern Africa is very Muslim, but it's constellated around Saudi Arabia because all of these nations are Arab. All right. And I would say that within the Muslim world, you also have Persia, which is Iran, modern-day Iran today. And that's like a powerhouse economically, and that there would be nations that would constellate around Persia or Iran. And then when you get into India, you have the Hindustani culture. In China, you have the Han culture. Not so much, I don't agree with this differentiation between the Cynic and the Buddhists, because I think that these are all Eastern monists. It's pretty compatible. Like some people would say, like, well, Western China is Buddhist, Eastern China is Confucianist. Well, I think it's flavors of the same fruit. It's like different types of apples. Not even different. It's not apples and oranges. It's different types of apples. And then, what will happen is that you have a country like India where it's a traditional Hindu culture, but within India, the second largest group is Christians. It's a minority. I think it's like 15% of the country is Christian of some type. But the ancient culture is Hindustani. It's and actually that would include Pakistan as well, because the at one time India was actually ruled by Muslims for several centuries. I don't know the whole history of India, but there's a very good book I'm going to be referring to later. And then you go throughout the world, like what would happen with Australia, for instance? Would Australia gravitate more towards the Western Christian ideal, or what? How would they, how would they be aligned? Would China colonize Australia? What would happen there? Okay, so I don't necessarily agree with the alignments, but the idea, the concept, I agree with. Okay, going back to, oops, let's get out of this. Going back to the article, this is something that is happening, and it's creating a multipolar world. So the idea of the multipolar world is that for centuries up until the time of the Reformation, you had Christian civilization in Europe, and then the rest of the world really wasn't multipolar. It was just undiscovered. Like the Europeans didn't know that the New World existed prior to 1492. They didn't know much about Africa. China was not even discovered until after the year 1000. All right, so these countries all existed. They all existed independently of one another. It was not a multipolar world, but within Europe, you had a Christian civilization in the Middle Ages. Then what happened during the time of the Reformation is that the Holy Roman Empire broke up, and slowly over a period of centuries broke up into nation states, and it was pretty much, though, divided between Catholic and Protestant. There was a competition, so it was like a bipolar world, Catholics versus Protestants. After World War II, the bipolar world became the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had its satellites, which would be like China, Southeast Asia, some nations of Africa, some nations in South America, even Central America, Cuba. And then the United States was the other world power, the nuclear power. And both of these countries were the first two nuclear powers, and they were the largest net exporters that had the most natural resources. Okay, Soviet Union had one of the largest economies in the world. I think it was overrated, but it was very powerful. And Eastern Europe was the Soviet satellite. Let me see if I can find a real quick graphic of this. This is the Cold War bipolar world. And let's see if I can find an image of this, what that looked like. Yeah, this is basically the idea of this. It's not very good, but you get the idea that East versus West, and then the rest of this is called the Third World. All right, but it was bipolar. The two powers look like this. Okay. Here's another. This is what the bipolar world. This is just another. This is okay. All right, so this is something that's so what happened after that was that situation continued up until the time of 1991 with the downfall of the Soviet Union, and what happened then was the breakup. And basically now what we have is a unipolar world, or up until very recently anyway, from 1991 until this year. Basically, the United States and Europe have controlled the military actions of the world. We've controlled the economy, the banking system, the internet, communications, the media, entertainment. Everything comes out of America, and it affects the thinking of the rest of the world. But during that time, because of the fact that we've forced liberal democracies on people, what has happened is that many of these economies have enriched themselves and have emerged, and they've just developed a lot faster. And so now these economies and these political countries no longer want to be controlled by the EU and by America. They don't want NATO dominance in the military. They don't want the New World Order economic system. So they're building parallel structures. All right. So this is something that people recognize, and we see it in the Ukraine conflict. Ukraine conflict is kind of like a flashpoint. It's a symptom or a byproduct of the bipolar world. It's not the cause of it, but it's accelerating the development of the multipolar world. Excuse me. There was a bipolar world. Now we're shifting into the time of a multipolar world. And leaders have been saying that. Joe Biden said we're at an inflection point in history for real. It comes about every 6 or 8 generations where things are changing so rapidly that we have to be in control. So the idea of these New World Order globalists is this: we have to be in control. We have to stop this from happening. We must stop Christmas from coming. It's like we can't allow those Who's down in Whoville to have their joy. We need to be in control. All right. Then you have Olaf Scholz. Olaf Scholz is a little bit more moderate. He's just like, look, the theme of this meeting is history at a turning point. He's talking to globalists here at the Davos Forum. A theme that encompasses far more than solely this breach of international peaceful order. In other words, the war in Ukraine isn't the big thing. There's something that's bigger than that going on, is that we're at a turning point in history. I see another global development that constitutes a watershed. We are experiencing what it means to live in a multipolar world. Now, George Soros is another one of these Grinch fellows who wants to stop this new world order, this new multipolar order from happening. It is a new world order, but it's not unipolar globalism, it's multipolar, all right? The best and perhaps only way to preserve our civilization is to defeat Putin as soon as possible. That's the bottom line. What does he mean? What do you mean, we Kimosabe? I don't know if you ever saw that Mad Magazine cartoon. It's there's a picture of the Lone Ranger, and they're up. Let's see if I can find that. This is a little divergence, but I like to do that. What do you mean, we Kimosabe? So I think that this is an appropriate metaphor to what we're talking about here. This is like an old site. Let's see if I can go back real quick. Oh yeah, here we go. This is the Lone Ranger. All right. Indians all around us. Well, Tonto, old Kimosabe, it looks like we're finished. He's like, what you mean, we Kimosabe? So I always like to use that one because it's whenever anyone says we want to preserve our. What does he mean by our civilization, right? Well, he's talking about the Western global hegemony. He's talking about the New World Order, the one where we have to be in control. So the only way to do that, the best and perhaps only way to do that, is to defeat Putin as soon as possible. That's the bottom line. And that's not going to happen. Even without Putin, this was going to happen anyway. That's why I'm not, necessarily pro-Putin. I'm glad that this is an inflection point. I'm glad that this is happening now because it's going to speed things up. I'm very sorry about the war and that people are being killed. This is a great tragedy, but the whole idea is that if we defeat Putin, we can preserve our way of life. That's not going to happen. It's just going to prolong things and make things more miserable and lead to other wars where the West is trying to hang on for as long as possible. The Soviet Union collapsed without a gun being fired. There were other clashes and civil wars that happened after that. About 200,000 people were killed in post-Soviet countries after. But it didn't have to happen because of a nuclear war. It was just Gorbachev, Yeltsin, leaders in Russia decided that the Soviet Union is not viable. We need to lay down the structure and let people be independent. That's what the West needs to do too. But as long as we have people in power like Schultz and George Soros and Biden, that's not going to happen. Okay. The times ahead will be radically different from those we've experienced in our life. times, though similar to many times in history. This is Ray Dalio, and I'm going to show you this book in a minute. So I also put this down here. This is Yogi Berra. He was the Yankee catcher, one of the greatest baseball players of all time. He doesn't get enough credit because he had other great people on the team, but he was actually present for 10 World Series out of the 27 that is it 27 or 28? Anyway, out of all the World Series that the Yankees have won, he was on 10 of them. So that's like a world record as far as world championships. More than Michael Jordan, more than any other player. It's tough to make decisions, especially about the future. So just take everything I say with a grain of salt that I'm talking about here. I am basically moving from, as a student of this, I'm learning about a lot of this for the first time. And so I start off my article by saying, an earth-shaking shift in the world's regional powers is coming. How do I know? History shows this happens all the time, and coming with it is an incredible opportunity to participate in Christ's victorious kingdom as it forcefully advances in the nations. If you look up Ray Dalio, he has a very good video that's a synopsis of his book. And it's two different versions of it. Here's the shorter version. And it's very well done. It basically, he reads from the book.
The changing world order. The times ahead will be radically different from those that we've experienced in our lifetimes, though similar to many times before. How do I know that? Because they always have been.
So you can see I stole that from him, but
over my roughly
I'll give him credit for it.
Global macroeconomic investing.
So he's a billionaire who basically wanted to see cycles. He wanted to look at cycles of economic change in the nations in order to be able to predict the future. And so he thinks that we're at a time right now where there's this collapse of one order, right, and then a collapse of another time. George Soros frequently talks about the fact he's funded color revolutions all over the world since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And he denies that he's involved with regime change, but they do it a little bit more covertly like that. They fund groups that get involved with political campaigns, and they have brought regime change, these color revolutions throughout the world. And he is part of this large group of investors, not him alone, but other people, that brought about the current crisis in Ukraine, which began in 2014. Didn't begin today. So I used to look at people that always talked about George Soros, like he's the Emperor Palpatine or something like that. I thought that this is a little bit nutty. It's a conspiracy theory, but I've discovered that, this is actually in large part true. He wants this new world order in which liberal democracy is forced on everyone. And it could, people think that could result in another type of tyranny, which I agree with. I've never thought that it could happen. People have tried to conquer the world, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, Hitler, Mussolini, right? But what's happening today is that the new power men don't fight with guns, right? They have money, right? So they're powerful men. They're not elected leaders, which makes them, they're oligarchs, which makes them more dangerous. And they basically fight their wars economically. It's called hybrid warfare. So that's what's going on with Russia. That's the reason why they're going to fail too, is because they don't understand that the economic system of the world has changed a lot in the last 30 years. Okay, let me backtrack a little bit. I'm going to talk about the fact that I first got introduced to this idea of the multipolar world and Christian civilization from this guy right here. Dr. Steve Turley, I don't know how I would describe him, a conservative, a patriot, and I agree with him on most things. I think he's a little bit too much rah-rah Trump, but I'm not really a Trump supporter myself. I think Trump is a phenomenon who's a symptom of this whole changing world order that we're in. Okay, this is, but he has a very, very good videos. He's my favorite YouTube channel by far. And I agree with 99, I'll say between 99 to 95% of what he's saying. He's very good. So I got introduced to this concept of the civilization state and the multipolar world. And he basically looks at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia as being this is a really good one right here. So go to this channel and watch it. It's awesome.
We're offering homeowners a new roof when they also
Just give you an idea of.
The invasion of Ukraine didn't come out of the blue. The world has been increasingly engaged in a struggle between two systems of governance that are diametrically opposed to each other: open society and closed society. Let me define the difference as simply as I can. In an open society,
Emperor
the role
Palpatine
of
speaks.
the
If you like
state
Star Wars, it's
is to protect the freedom of the individual. In a closed society, the role of the individual is to serve the rulers of the state.
sounds good. Sounds so innocent on the surface.
Concerning all of humanity, fighting pandemics and climate change,
Fighting climate
avoiding
change.
nuclear war,
Yes.
maintaining global institutions,
Yes.
have had to take a
Global
backseat
institutions.
to that struggle. That's why I say our civilization. may
Our
not
civilization may not survive.
You heard it yourself, folks. George Soros has come to Davos to tell his fellow elites that Russia's invasion is indeed bringing their globalist world to a crushing end. We're going to look at Soros' comments. We're going to see how this is not the first time he said this. And stick with the very end of this video and I'll reveal why Soros' concerns are all too little too late. The globalist world has indeed come to an end.
So my point in this, I mean, watch Steve Turley, he's awesome. But my point in this is that, this is not something that, it's not a wild conspiracy theory. This is something virtually everyone is saying that knows anything about geopolitics. And the idea goes all the way back to, let's see, where is my scribed? There's a bunch of books I'm going to be going through in this series. Samuel P. Huntington, Clash of Civilization. This is Steve Turley's book, Return of Christendom, is a good one. This guy is very controversial. He's a Russian, called The Fourth Political Theory, although, again, another one that I would not agree with everything that he's... None of these guys can I endorse fully. Steve Turley is obviously the best one, but I don't endorse fully everything they say, but they're very good at describing the phenomenon. Ray Dalio, who I mentioned already, Alexander Dugin, who I'll talk about in a minute here, and also Samuel P. Huntington, who's kind of like the popularizer of the civilization state multipolar theory back in 1996. All right, so I saw this and I said, this jives so much with what I believe that I can't believe I haven't heard about this before. Why haven't I heard about this? And what I realized is that I've actually been writing about this for 30 years. I just didn't call it what it was, and I was missing one element of it. So let me just back up. I started writing with the Forerunner in the summer of 1989, and one of my first articles I was assigned to was have a conversation with this Eastern Bloc missionary named Jim Gilbert. Good friend of mine. I met him one time, 2 times, 3 times, something like that. I've met him a few times, but we've been in contact for the last 30 years. And it's called The Coming Transformation of the USSR. And this is what Jim Gilbert says. We have an open door and few people are aware of it. American Christians are so used to thinking of the Soviet Union as an evil power that's going to invade Israel that most do not believe a total turnaround is possible. Instead of reading the latest prophecy book about Mikhail Gorbachev being in league with the Antichrist and wondering what that birthmark on his forehead really means, we should be mobilizing to invade the Soviet Union for the gospel. So this is 1989, and we actually did this map. Lee Grady, who is the graphic artist and my boss at the time, he did this wonderful map and graphic. I did the article, and we said, oh yeah, the Soviet Union could break up into Karelia, the Komi Republic, all these different republics, the Republic of Kazakh, Uzbek, Tajik, George, Armenian. And I remember that our overseer in our ministry, Bob Weiner, he basically looked at this and said, are you sure this is crazy? because this was September 1989. Now, I challenge anyone watching this, find another publication anywhere that predicted this, that actually said this is what's going to happen. The Soviet Union is going to break up into 15 separate republics. We said there's different possibilities of how perestroika could work out. The first one is it could fail and they could go back into the Soviet communism, like Brezhnev or Andropov. But that's unlikely. Second possibility is that, hey, perestroika might work, that somehow capitalism can revise communism. We said that you can't revitalize something that's dead. You can't reconstruct something that's failed from the foundation. So the third possibility is a total failure of the communist system and breakup of the Soviet state into separate self-governing nations. The Ukraine, with a population of almost 50 million people, will be the largest nation in Europe besides Russia if it is restored to self-rulership. Brown believes that Brown was Jim Gilbert because he wanted to be secret because he was going into Eastern Bloc countries. So Gilbert believes it's likely to happen within the next 10 years. Happened within a year and a half. Gorbachev, actually 2 years actually. Gorbachev, he says, could emerge as a benevolent dictator over the remaining state of Russia and the Siberian state. So shortly after that, I started going to the Soviet Union and so on. So I did another article around the time that I was going to the Soviet Union, and this is, basically I had founded Media House International, stopped doing the print version of the Forerunner. We put it online on internet version, and we started doing print versions of the Forerunner in Latin America, Russia, Ukraine, all over the place. And so I had this idea, it's called the Puritan Hope in a Post-Cold War Era. And it's the idea that, well, now we have this new world. What's the real hope? Okay? When Russian youth flock to evangelistic campaigns held by Western missionaries, they're introduced to a personal savior and a promise of reaching heaven. What they came for instead was an answer to their personal economic woes. They gladly embrace the promise of personal regeneration, but they're offered a little hope beyond that, besides a smile and Jesus loves you. They are rarely told that Jesus Christ is a king who demands complete obedience, and that his disciples are obligated to take every thought captive and bring every area of society under his lordship. The question we need to ask as present is, what is the proper role of the church during this time? It is only the reformed strain of historic Orthodox Christianity embodied in Puritan thought, emphasizing the lordship of Jesus Christ in the totality of life that is the hope of Russia, Ukraine, China, Cuba, South Africa, India, etc. The future course of many nations could be determined by the voice of the church, prophetically warning against personal ambition and entangling alliances, but encouraging instead a historical optimism with the possibility of covenants among the Christian nations to ensure lasting peace. Another article I did was called The Fallen Star of Islam, and I said that during the past 2 years, the world has watched as communism, the great enemy of freedom, has fallen. The people of many nations quickly overturn their communist governments in favor of a more democratic representation of their people. So basically what I was talking about there was liberal democracy, not Puritanism, not Orthodox Christianity, but liberal democracy. That was my error. That's the one thing that I was missing in this whole formula. Now a confrontation in the Middle East promises to overturn another great power, Islam. The Muslim people of the world are not the targets of this confrontation. They too will be liberated. With communism almost eliminated from the contest of the hearts and minds of the human race, there are only two remaining forces competing for world domination: Christianity and Islam. I boldly predicted in the same article, governments throughout the Middle East and Africa and Asia will dissolve overnight. Democracies will replace dictatorships. Resulting freedom of religion will allow a great influx of Christianity, the true salt of the earth, to invade the nations and preserve peace, not war. Because peace can only be realized when Christ is formed in the hearts of the people. Now, I revisited this back in 2011. That was 20 years later. I kind of said, Now, one thing that I had wrong about this was that I still looked at things as being unipolar. Like it was going to be the United States that was going to fight Islam and basically liberate people from Islam. But the United States is not the beacon of Christian Puritanism that it was. Another thing I wrote about was this thing here, the fiber optics revolution. I wrote all this stuff around the same time. And I said that, the internet, Forerunner was one of the first Christian ministries on the internet. We were on the World Wide Web before the World Wide Web existed, actually, because we actually were on the World Wide Web in 1991. Actually, before it existed, but before it became popular. And we're actually on a server at Dartmouth. And you could download all of our files in Microsoft Word format. I had like several hundred articles that I gave to a ministry in Dartmouth, and we put all the articles online. And then when the World Wide Web became more viable, we did the Forerunner online, forerunner.com. So I knew about this, and I said that, through the internet, the biggest changes will come. So George Gilder wrote this book in 1990, and I found out about this through a newsletter by Gary North. Bought the book, read it. And what he said was the United States only has to unleash its industrial resources to command the telefuture, in which new technology will overthrow the stultifying influence of mass media, renew the power of individuals, and promote democracy before the world. Again, there's that false idea that liberal democracy is something wonderful, and we'll talk about that more as I go on here. I'm not against democracy, but the liberal democracy and neoliberalism and neoconservatism is actually a form of tyranny. It's not democratic at all, but we'll talk about that. So I wrote this article called The Fiber Optics Revolution, and I said, this is very early on. This is before, almost anyone had a modem or was online. This was in 1993 I wrote this. The biggest changes will come as highly centralized organizations become decentralized. Pyramidal structures will become inverted, opening up the way for the average person to become entrepreneurial, self-reliant, and individualized. The fiber optics revolution will further the spread of democracy. See, there I am again, going on about democracy, and free market economics in the whole world. The top entertainment networks will not be organizations such as CNN, ABC, NBC, or CBS. Fox News didn't really even exist when I wrote this, so it's interesting. The television networks will not be run by the media elite, but more and more by ordinary people. Soon public television networks will form to produce more viewer-supported productions. Okay, so that's actually happened. So I put this quote by Gary North: the gatekeepers are still in place, but the walls are down. Like, we have the power through the internet to basically take over the world. The problem is people are still stuck in this old paradigm, this old way of thinking. That's what I was saying. So this article was about the Occupy movement back in 2011. And what I was saying is that, we're going to see more and more people on the streets. And, what I believe is next on God's timetable is the complete breakdown of Western humanism. See, this is the key. Liberal democracy is much like communism. There's socialism, which is like communism light. That's the Western model. It's the government of Western Europe. It's globalist, but it's based on Western humanism, just like communism is. Okay, this philosophy is in fact the twin cousin of Marxist communism and had its origin in the time of the Enlightenment 250 years ago. Now, this philosophy, which had the seeds of its own destruction sown into its foundation, has already run its course. The Occupy movement can be interpreted as the death scream of Western humanism. So I'm writing in 2011, and I had written 2 articles in 1995, which I never published. I just kind of kept them on my computer. And one of them is called Covenantal Blessings and Curses in History. And this is kind of like the 500-year theory, which says that there are these paradigm shifts that occur every 500 years. There's the downfall of Jerusalem, the takeover of the church, and then the final takeover of the church, which is the medieval period, right? And basically, civilization was kind of frozen during this time. It was feudalistic, it was Orthodox, it was Christian. And then we get to the rise of scholasticism from 1000 to 1500. Then you had the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, the Renaissance. And then we're in Paradigm Shift 2000, which is we're in the time we're in today. And I said, we are seeing the downfall of secularism in postmodern history. The sweeping changes we see in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, and China are a natural fruition of the principles laid down at the time of the Reformation. In the West, we will see a complete breakdown of secularism within the next 5 to 10 years. And I wrote this in 1995, so I'm saying like, well, by 2005, I was very hopeful. But I think that I can say with almost 100% surety that we're seeing it in 2022. So all right. So this is my article on the Puritan hope, which is something I've repeated over and over again. This is my part 2, which is called The Downfall of Liberal Secularism. So I'll put links to all these. You can read them. And I basically go through the same kind of idea. What's covenantal theology and so on. This is a shift that has to take place in the church. All right, so the error in my thinking in the very beginning was I believed that we had to the error in my thinking in the beginning was I believed that the United States was going to lead this as a Christian nation. Now what I'm realizing is that it's not necessary for the United States to lead Christians in India. It's not necessary for the United States to lead Christians in Iran or in Egypt or in Brazil. They can do it. They're perfectly capable of leading their own Reformation. And their Reformation is not going to look like our Reformation today. I mean, it's not going to look like our Reformation in America or the Reformation in the 1500s. It's going to look completely different than that, but it's going to be based on some of the same core principles in the Bible. All right. So all these books that I mentioned here, this is a really good website, by the way. It's called Scribed, and it's better than Amazon.com because for half the price you get both ebooks, audiobooks, magazines, and so on. And here are some of the Here are some of the books that I recommend. Clash of Civilizations by Samuel P. Huntington. Return of Christendom by Steve Turley. There's this guy here, The Fourth Political Theory by Alexander Dugin, who's a Russian. And then Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail. This is an economic theory. This is a cultural theory. This is a Christian theory. And this is a... let me just look at this table of contents in this one. This is the one that I have not started to read yet, but it's the most important one. Basically, he describes what civilizations are, right? And the future of civilizations. So he sees there's going to be a time of war between different civilizations. I see things a little bit differently. Like I see that, if you were to look at this map here, if you notice that these countries that are mentioned here, the United States and Canada, Brazil and Venezuela, Africa, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, India. Okay. If you look at these here, what you notice is these are the countries with the most natural resources in the world. Okay. Russia, and it gives the actual amount, which is kind of incredible. Russia is by far the richest country in the world, 75 trillion. Gas, coal, oil, natural resources, gold, timber, rare earth metals. Rare earth metals and gases are responsible for things like the production of microchips, things like that. And people don't realize how much control Russia has over the world economy. We're going to find out very soon, unfortunately for the West. But the United States is number 2, followed by Saudi Arabia, followed by Canada, Iran, China, Brazil. And it's like you wouldn't think of Brazil as being a world power, but potentially they are. This is the thing. What you need, then we have Australia, Iraq, and Venezuela, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, but it's one of the richest. Irony. And why are they one of the poorest? Well, largely it's because of the whole unipolar system. Okay. Of course, it's the fault of them electing communists as their government, but that's besides the point. All right, so these are the countries with the most natural resources, and if you look on the map, this is the reason why we have I skipped over this, but The reason why we have the war in Ukraine is that really the West plan since the time of the fall of the Soviet Union was to try to weaken Moscow so that Karelia could go back to Finland. Tatarstan, they would kind of use like the Muslims in Tatarstan to cause unrest, use the Georgian War, use the war in Donbass to cause problems for Moscow, and then hit them with sanctions. And then there would be regime change. We could put in a client government like we did in Ukraine, like we tried to do in Belarus and failed, and like we did in Georgia, and support those corrupt governments, and then get rid of the corrupt government in Moscow, put in our own corrupt client government, and then basically we could sell off all the natural resources in Ural and Siberia to oil, to big oil. And these are the other groups like Chechnya. All these groups along the border of Georgia and Russia are all potentially little hothouses, little potential war zones. And Russia's actually done a very good job. People think that they did a terrible job with Chechnya, but I actually think that Chechnya could have been something much worse. It could have engulfed the entire region. It could have engulfed, the Central Asia. It could have, but in stopping Chechnya from what's the word I'm looking for here? From escalating into a major war with these other countries between Muslims and Russia, they stopped it, and then now basically everyone else fell into line. It was like, so the whole idea between Huntington's book is he's saying that there's going to be all these wars now, like wars are going to be regional wars between civilizations. I think not. I think that what's going to happen is you'll have Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia right now is a nation state controlled by the West, but once Saudi Arabia is allowed to be Arab and allowed to be Muslim, excuse me, but I know that people don't want Saudi Arabia to be Muslim because we think of Muslims as being all jihadists, which is not actually true, by the way. They're not all jihadists. The philosophy of Islam is jihadist, but modern Islam, Sunni Islam, is very different than that. They interpret they interpret the. I know people will not like what I'm saying here, but the whole point is that Saudi Arabia will gather these other OPEC nations. They'll bring them together, and that will be the focal point. And they'll be united by their common, from Morocco all the way to Iraq. That will be their uniting. And then you have Pakistan, India, these other Muslim groups are also band together. And what will happen over a period of time is that you'll have Christianity will be able to influence the society, maybe in the next 100 years or so. It's not going to happen immediately, but it will happen eventually. Same thing in China and so on. And if you notice that these countries have these little buffer zones, there are countries around them that are smaller that are not, like for instance, Israel is not Arab. Turkey is not Arab. But they form like a buffer zone. Like Turkey is the buffer zone between the Middle East and Russia. They form like mediators. America has it very good because Canada and the United States are basically the same civilization. And we're two different political entities, but we're two different, but we're the same civilization. We're the same culture. And then you have a dividing line through the rest of Latin America. Mexico could actually be pulled into the United States orbit, and Mexico would serve as a buffer between us and Latin America so that there aren't problems. So I actually see that this whole idea of civilization states is that there's always like border countries, like there's Ukraine, Belarus, Transnistria, that form a buffer zone between Russia and the whole Western alliance. Okay, so that's kind of like the idea. Same thing with India. There are all these smaller nations that form a buffer zone between India and China, and then you have the Himalayan mountains, so it keeps them from fighting. All right, Australia is a landmass, it's a continent unto itself, and so on. So it's like the world is set up, I believe, by God with these different nations, so that if these nations form civilizations, then other smaller cultures, like the subcultures, they constellate around those spheres, and as long as the civilizations, they stay in their own spheres and they stay in their own place, then the only real wars are along the borders. They don't actually ever try to invade or take over each other because they can't. It's like Russia can never take over Europe. They can never take over the United States. It can never take over China. But Russia can take over the Russian world, which is the Slavic people. And it doesn't have to be done militarily. It can be done by just cultural influence, through economic trade, through religion, and so on. That's the way it should be. So we're entering into this new order. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to end up with this thing that Jim Gilbert talked about. Later, I'm going to be talking about how Russia and China and India got together recently, and they basically issued this statement to the Western Bloc saying that, we are now 3 of the spheres in the multipolar world. This is how we're going to be at peace with each other, and we expect the West to play ball. And people kind of laughed at this when they put this out, like, oh, Russia and China, they're asserting their dominance, and so on. Let me just read this because this is kind of important. So in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, most Western analysts view Russian President Vladimir Putin as trying to rebuild a nation-state empire like the Soviet Union that's based on political and economic philosophy. On the contrary, Putin is not trying to conquer the world for Marxist-Leninism as the Soviet dictators attempted. Russia has moved on to a market economy similar to the Western model. Putin is trying to align the Russian world along their historic and ethno-linguistic boundaries in order to build a civilization state based on the traditional values of Russian culture. Western ideologues not only misunderstand the intention, but they are hell-bent on the type of world conquest because they are hell-bent on the same type of world conquest because they accuse Russia of attempting. So in other words, they project our own goal of unipolar world conquest, creating a new world order. We project that on Russia, right? Although they justify it because in their view, Western political and economic ideals are superior. So we look down on Russia, don't understand Russia, and we think that they're trying to do the same thing that we're doing. Like we can kill millions of people in the Middle East, but Russia can't kill tens of thousands in Ukraine. That's immoral. In the meantime, Russia, of course, it's all immoral, but I'm saying that there's a lot of hypocrisy that's there. In the meantime, Russia and China issued a joint statement in January insisting that although democracy and human rights are universal human values, fix that, individual cultures define it differently. To Russia, traditional values align with Eastern Orthodox Christianity and are of paramount importance. To paternalist China, loyalty to the ruling authorities must be maintained. So they kind of like have this ancestor worship, paternalism, like loyalty to your elders, that type of thing. That's their culture. To the Western Bloc, and there's a lot of philosophy that goes along with that, obviously too. Ancient China is not so much a religious culture, but a philosophical culture. Okay, it's not so much religious. Russia is a lot more mystical and religious than China is, although people think the opposite, but it's actually Russia is the Eastern mystical tradition, and China is really more of the philosophical, more closer to the Greek, kind of like closer to Greek philosophy than we realize, although it's monistic rather than, anyway, I'm not going to get into all that. So to the Western Bloc, especially among the non-elected body of UN and globalist think tanks, such as the Davos Forum, a more modern accommodation to human rights must be promoted, including universal access to abortion, LGBTQ rights, and other aspects of woke culture. These conflicting values cause a clash of cultures, a clash of civilizations. So at one time I was comforted that America was the only remaining superpower in the world. I now thank God that the unipolar world has run its course. The walls are down, but the sentries are still guarding the gates. Egalitarian humanism has collapsed. It's much like the time when the angel freed Paul and Silas from jail in Acts. It's not Paul and Silas, it's Peter. Sorry, I have to change that. Some disciples believed when they saw him that it must be a ghost, his angel, even though they've been praying for his release. Like Peter, we've been released, and our job is to get to work at building our Christian civilization. Okay, that's part one. I'll come back with part two in a couple of days.